Alrighty. Well, we are in Exodus chapter 21, and that means we are officially halfway through the book of Exodus. Only took us 13, what did I say? It's 21. Don't look so sad, Alice. You can go back and watch the old videos and see all of chapter 20 again. Now, if you look about 5 lines down, you'll notice this is Exodus 21. Oh, now I see it. Now that I read the directions, I see exactly what you're talking about, Professor. For the rest of us, we're halfway through the book of Exodus. For Lola and Alice, they're still somewhere in the first half of the book, eventually catching up with us somewhere down the road. But we began last June, so it's taken us about 13 months to get this far. And so assume they're about to finish the book up as we go through. But we're in chapter 21 if you want to find your way there, because that's what we'll be reading from in a moment. But to fill in the blanks related to chapter 20, so that Lola will be pleased with all the material we give her, let's kind of recap a couple things to this point from chapter 20. Because we had the week off last week because of business meeting. Remember, chapter 20, Moses and the people have arrived at Mount Sinai. Moses records for us, the beginning of chapter 20, God giving the 10 Commandments. But if you remember from a couple weeks ago, I pointed out after the 10 Commandments are given, if you read the text, the people of Israel are actually there. This is not like the movie where Moses only goes to the mountain and gets the 10 Commandments. God speaks to them en masse. And when he does, the people actually refused to approach God. Remember, he said, when you hear the trumpet, come up to me. The trumpet blew, they didn't. He came down to them. So the people refused to go up and approach God, and that's why later on he does call Moses alone up at the end of chapter 20. But remember, part of their motivation was that they realized that their sin would be their ultimate undoing. That if we go into the presence of God, we're dead. Now, of course, there's an irony in that that's theologically true, but what had God already told them to do? Come to me. So, while worried about their sin, they sin some more. But they've refused to go up, so God was ultimately at the end called Moses up. And so only Moses goes up onto the mountain then to approach God in the cloud. Now he's up there. Moses is on the mountaintop, and he's not getting the 10 Commandments. God will give him another set of the stone tablets later. Right now what he's doing is Moses is up on the mountaintop, and God has given him what Old Testament theologians call the covenant code. This is the covenant code. Some argue about where it begins. I argue it begins in the middle of chapter 20. Some argue about where it ends. That's irrelevant to our discussion tonight. But this is what's called the covenant code. Essentially what God is giving them are a series of other laws, to use that word, that are essentially implications of the 10 words, of the 10 Commandments. He's already given them the 10. Now Moses, tell them, when this happens, this is how it fits under the larger schema of the 10 Commandments. And so if you remember from a couple weeks ago, we looked at a couple of these codes, if you will. And the first of them there at the end of chapter 20 related to what we've been calling the first table of the 10 Commandments. Remember, the 10 Commandments are broken into 2 tables. The first table, or the first 4 commandments, they relate to how we relate to God. Now, here in chapter 21, all the other codes that we're going to be given relate to the second table of the 10 Commandments. Commandments number 5 through 10. And if you remember, if the first table relates to our relationship with God, what's the second table do? It's man's relationship with man. And so the laws we're going to look at tonight, next week, the next week, because it's going to take us a little bit to get through chapter 21. It's a little longer. Plus, it'll give Alice time to catch up with us in chapter 21. See what you caused, Debbie? A year ago, you sent word through your courier. Could you tell him to write down which chapter we're in? Because I can't always tell where we're at. And so now I put the chapters down, and Lola and Alice can't tell where we're at. Oh, my toes are fine. If you'd like, I can step on yours some more. All right. So chapter 21, let's go ahead and read starting at verse 1. Now, remember, Moses loves to start new thoughts with that word, right? We've seen it repeatedly over and over. Now, these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be a slave forever. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. And so, interesting stuff tonight. Things that if you just read it surface level, you're going to have all kinds of confusions, heartaches, griefs. This is the kind of passage critics of the Bible will go, oh, see what your Bible says to do? In fact, I saw one the other day on the internet. Somebody had posted a tally sheet of all the people they believed God was responsible for having killed in the Old Testament. 4,000 of these people, 10,000 of these people. You're going, lighten up. You're missing the whole point. A lot of people did die. Can't deny that. We can talk about why. But in this case, the real reason, the real meaning behind this text is about that deep below the surface. If you read it at face value, you're going to have all kinds of problems. If you read it as face value as an American, you're going to have more problems. If you're going to read it at face value as an American in 2021, in light of all the other political things we've got going on in our country, you're going to have lots of problems. And if you live in the South, in light of all that, you're going to even have bigger problems with this passage. Because as soon as you say the S word, all of a sudden all bets are off, right? Because all of a sudden we got to get politically correct and we got to figure out how to talk about this and, oh man, why would they do that? Stop. Take a deep breath. We'll get there in a minute. It's not what you think it is. Well, let's go ahead and look at verse 1 because it sets the stage for all that follows. Again, there's that word Moses likes. Now, these are the rules that you shall set before them. And so Moses is up on the mountain. God is giving him the covenant code, and he's going to take this body of rules or laws, if you like that word better, and take them down before the people. Now, it could get a little confusing here, but so let's just real quickly clarify that. The fact that there are new laws or rules here is not to demean the 10 Commandments. Remember? He's not saying these are over here, these are more important. The way it's phrased here is to make sure they understand that these new rules, these additional rules, are to be elevated in their importance. He's not saying these rules are just as important or more important than the 10 I already gave you, lowering the value of the 10 Commandments. What he's saying is you're going to hold the 10 in such high esteem that if we're not careful, we're going to ignore these other rules, right? You all know people who do this. When they talk about sinning, they go, I didn't break any of the 10. What have they ignored? Every other law and commandment in the Bible. We do it oftentimes when we only read the New Testament to the exclusion of the Old Testament. And so when he says you're to set these roles before them, it's not to say these are unimportant. It's to say these are also important. Make sure they understand these are also big deals. Because otherwise, we could have 2 tiers of law here, and that's not what he's doing. Remember, what he's doing is explaining the implications of the top 10. And so not to tear down the one, it's to lift up the other. But let's go ahead and jump into the hard stuff. Let's start there, verse 2. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. And so, red lights, right? All kinds of, bells and whistles going off. That word slave can be very confusing, alarming, worrisome, troublesome, whatever you want to say, for American readers in particular. We have a slave issue, right? One historian has argued the most important event in American history was the Civil War. That everything we've done either led up to it or has been a result of it. And I think it's probably a pretty fair assessment. In light of all the big stuff we've been involved in, what are we still dealing with? What's all the CRT, all the woke discussions, all that about? How we deal with the African American slaves and their ancestors. So we've got to be careful here. When we read the Bible, I know we've talked about it in the devotions on the weekdays, Chris has talked about it, I've talked about it. We need to make sure that when we read the Bible, we read it in its context, not ours. Because as soon as you try to read in ours, all kinds of strange things happen. Give you an example, and I won't tell you who. I was looking at the internet earlier today, and a friend posted something on social media to the effect of, I always knew that they, whoever they are going to find some way to belittle the rapture. Huh? And the way they're going to belittle the rapture, according to this friend, is the UFO report that just came out the other day. First of all, there's a lot of debate about the rapture, but let's not bring the UFOs into it. They have nothing to do with that discussion. So we've got to be careful not to import American slavery, either defenses of it before the war or all the weird things that have happened in 160 years since. Don't import that backwards to the year 1500 or 1400 BC. It's got all kinds of different connotations that don't fit this passage at all. Now, let's be honest here. Part of the confusion comes from the fact that the Hebrew language, like it does so many times, offers multiple words that we translate as only one word in English. I tell my students all the time, don't spend an entire sermon explaining to people, there are 17 different words for love in Greek and only one in English. But it's true. Not 17, there aren't that many, thank goodness. But there are multiples. And there are multiple Hebrew words that we translate into English simply as slave in the Old Testament. And so, one thing in, the American language, the English language, is pretty inferior compared to some other languages. We just don't have the words they've got. And so we sometimes have to pick one word that, without nuance, isn't what that word really means. And so we've got to be careful what we're doing here. Now, in the case of those multiple Hebrew words that we translate simply as slave, they have, if we're honest, similar meanings. They're related, but dig deeper, they have different meanings. Now, some of you are going, okay, that's not helped me at all. Thank you very much. Think about, for example, we'll use the Greek word for love, all the different words. Your Bible translates it as usually love. For God so loved the world, John 3:16. But that's one type of love. There's another type of love that refers to intimate relations. See what I mean? They're related. One is love, the other one's love, but are they the same thing? No. Meanings are similar, but at the end of the day, different. Here's your fancy word for the day, and it's a very easy one to spell. Where's Jessica? Always have to spell for Jessica. This is what we refer to as semantic domain. Some of you all use, that's just semantics. Yeah. Semantic domain is this concept that if I take this word slave, and if I drew it on my dry erase board and put a slave and put a circle around it, in that domain are actually multiple words that are similar to slave. Some closer to the center, and some just barely related to slave. That's semantic domain. Again, love's a good example of that. I can love this. I can have a crush on that and call it love. I can love my wife. There are days I love my dogs, but are they all the same thing? No, they're in the domain, but if I was reading carefully, I discover they're not the same. So when we look at this word slave in your English Bible tonight, in this semantic domain that slave inhabits for us are actually multiple words that might be better translated servant. A slave and a servant are different. It could be translated as slave and be close to what we understand that word to mean, but it could also be translated bond servant. Right? Paul talks about himself in the New Testament. I'm a bond servant. So all are loosely related, but is a servant in the White House the same as a slave in one of the plantations 200 years ago? No. Semantic domain. Now, let's demystify all this one step further, because we're living in the American South and there are just across the river a bunch of plantations that theoretically are there to remind us of slavery. No Hebrew word about this domain. No Hebrew word that your Bible simply translates as slave. Not one of them refers to the American concept of chattel slavery. You all familiar with that from your history classes years ago? Some of you more years ago. Chattel slavery, the idea of you own somebody. A whole race of somebodies is subject to this type of slavery because the assumption is they're inferior. And so they're just property that you can use like a piece of sandpaper, and when you're done, throw it away. That's chattel slavery. Not a word in the Hebrew is that kind of slavery. So right off the bat, if somebody wants to freak out and go, oh, your Bible talks about slavery and condones it. No, not if that's what you mean. Now, is there slavery in the Bible? Yes. And we go, hey, slavery's a great thing. No, but it's not what you're thinking. And so, again, we've got to back up 3,500 years to make sure we're with them. Because at the end of the day, context, doesn't it, determines the meaning. For example, we'll pick on John, the gospel writer. For God so loved who? The world. Great, he loved the world. Does that mean he loved the planet? Terra firma? Does that mean he loved every human being then, there, and ever after? Does it mean he loved sinners? Because sometimes the Bible talks about the world or sinful humans. There's 3 different uses of the word world that John uses just in his book. And so to understand John 3:16, when he says that God loved the world, what do you have to look at? Context. What's he talking about right here? If you can't figure it out, you back up and go, what is John talking about in the book of John? Oh, wait a minute. He uses it 3 different ways. Now what do I do? Okay, well, let's go read all the letters of John. How does he talk about it there? If that doesn't solve it, okay, what about Revelation? And so context drives your meaning. As one of my friends said years ago, he thought it was, catchy, but it's what the truth is true. That any text, some of you familiar with this, read with a pretext, or let me say it the way he did it. He would always say, any text taken out of context is pretext. Meaning what? You've heard some variation of this. It means you're importing into the text what you want it to mean, not getting the meaning out of the text. This is the fancy words I sometimes use. Exegesis, get the meaning out, exit, versus eisegesis, meaning put the meaning into the text. So that's what I'm saying here tonight in this passage. And again, we're 20 minutes in and we're not even out of verse 2 yet. That's how important this is. Because if we don't read it as Moses meant it, we don't get the meaning. And we might as well stop reading. Because otherwise, it's going to create a whole host of problems for us that aren't going to go away. So, he says anyone buys a slave. It doesn't mean what you think it means. There could be multiple meanings of that word slave. Compound that with the fact that this shows up later in the Hebrew laws. Israelites could not own Hebrew slaves. Right? You've come across that in your reading? You cannot own a Hebrew slave if you're Hebrew. So either these texts contradict each other, or we're reading them in a contradictory way. And so we've got to read this text tonight, this paragraph and the next one, in light of that other rule. Because that other rule is quite clear. You cannot own anybody of your own nation. That's clear as day. So we got to take this less clear passage and interpret it in light of the clearer passage. And so they can't own anybody who's Hebrew. Oh man, so now what do we do with this slave thing? It's actually going to, some of you are going to go, I knew this already. Some of you are going to go, whoa, that changes everything. As you read this text, throwing away the American concept of slavery, as you read this text, the word slave in the English should be understood to be a contract servant. It's a contract servant. You have contracted with somebody for their service. Notice it there in verse 2. He tells you it's a contract without using the word contract. Because they're only your servant for how long? 6 years. You don't own them. They're working for you. Now, it's a pretty heavy workload that can be put on you here, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But it is limited to only 6 years. And when the contract expires, in the 7th year, the slave goes free for free. That is nowhere related to American slavery, is it? I mean, think about it. Some of you are unaware of this. British freed their slaves before we did, by about 2.5, 3 decades. Some of you may not realize this. When they finally did emancipate their slaves in the British Empire, the British government paid 20 million pounds to the owners to offset their loss. We didn't do that here. In fact, had we offered that kind of money, some of the Southerners may have gone, you know what? Here, you take them. But the British paid them off. It was the only way to get the law passed. And so they essentially compensated the loss of human property to their human owners. That's not here. These contract workers sign up for a work period of 6 years. When the 7th year comes, you can walk for free. Thus, there is no ownership implied in this passage. Now, some of you are going, well, then why does he use the word buy? What does he mean? What's he essentially implying here? Think about this that does carry over into our context. What's going on? Yeah, it's a fee. You're being paid for your service for whatever reason. Maybe you were deep in debt. And so you said, look, I'll come work for you for 6 years if you pay off my loan. And so you're buying them in the sense that you're paying for their service. And so the servant, the slave here, is actually benefiting financially from their servitude. It's not American slavery. You get paid. Now, the way they paid varied depending on your contract. Some would actually be paid along the way. I'll work for you for 6 years, Paul. You pay me $100 a month. $50 a month. Then again, I see the way you're dressed, and you probably can't afford that. $25 a month. But you worked along the way and got paid along the way. That's one way that these slaves were bought. Others, historically in the Bible, function like we would describe here in the American context as indentured servants. Indentured servants. For example, when they settled the early days of the colonies, many people who came over on the Mayflower, we always think about the Mayflower Pilgrims, and there were a bunch of people on the boat, like only 1/3 of them were the pilgrims. The rest of them were either merchants who wanted to come over and get in on what they saw was going to be a booming market, or they were people paid for by the merchants to go for them. And so David would agree, I want to go to the New World, but I can't afford the ticket to get on the boat. Chuck says, David, I'll pay for it if you work for me for 6 years and send me the profits from your store. So he's indentured. And so it's paid up front. You essentially reap no financial rewards other than the benefit of David's now in the free world, and he can do whatever he wants and not worry about King Charles or James or whoever back in England. And so some of them would be bought in the sense of the word we're using here. And then still others, and we've already come across this in the Old Testament, still others would have been paid like Jacob. Remember in the book of Genesis, what did Jacob do? He worked 7 years for a wife. He worked and then got paid, or tricked, as the case was. And so he worked another 7 years and got another wife. And then what did he do? Worked another 7 years and got all the animals that he wanted. So Jacob was essentially a servant or a slave in the picture that we're talking about here. So lots of ways you can go with the word slave here. Lots of ways you could go about being bought or so. At the end of the time, essentially, these people are employees. If you wanted to put it in the modern American context, what does this passage have to do with me today? What's the application? For those of you who are employers, you better learn the lesson. Those of you who are employees, there's a lesson here as well. And so, ancient world, continuing, timeless applications. So, we're talking about employees and employers. So, all of a sudden, it changes the meaning of the whole passage I read earlier, doesn't it? Just by knowing what he means by slaves. Now, let's go ahead and look at verses 3 and 4, and we're going to start picking up speed now. If he, talking about that Hebrew slave, if he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. Whoa, that's harsh. Well, again, think context, employer, employee, contract relationship. Verses 3 and 4 are essentially provisions in the contract. This is part of the covenant language, isn't it? I'll do this, you'll do that. And in this contract, these provisions are actually there to protect both the employer and the employee. Both parties are protected by what's just been said in verses 3 and 4. Neither one comes out ahead of the other one. They come into this relationship with benefits to both, and there are protections for both as we go through it. Here's how it looks. Verse 3, if the slave, the servant, the employee, comes into the relationship single, when he leaves, he must leave how? Single. Because what did the employer agree to do? I'm going to pay you and you alone. And so at the end of the time, what's he done? He's kept his end of the deal. What's the employee must do? He must keep his end of the deal. Now, by coming in single and going out single, in no way prohibits marriage. This is not to say servants or slaves, employees can't get married. Remember how important marriage is in Scripture. It's the first institution given to humans in Genesis 1. What's in mind here is protecting the employer's investment, most notably his investment in other servants. If he came in single and he found a wife amongst his employer's other servants, and if he left and took her with him, what has he just done to his boss? Robbed him of her service. Because if she's in his service as a servant or a slave, she has a contractual obligation to fulfill too. Chris agreed to work for 7 years. Sarah was over here. She agreed to work for 7 years or 6 years plus the free year. They get married in the middle of Chris's, but the beginning of Sarah's. At 6 years, Chris wants to leave. Sarah still owes 4 years. The master comes out on the bottom end if that happens. And so if you came in single, not saying you can't get married, you leave by yourself. This is not, again, don't think about slaves and the way we treated the spousal relationships and children in America. This is about contract obligations. Likewise, if the servant or slave is married when he's contracted, his spouse belongs to whom? Him. She's his, not the boss's. And thus, the first part of it, in verse 3, protects the employer. His investment is set and safe. The second part of verse 3 protects the employee. If I come in with a spouse, you can't tell me she can't leave. She was with me when I came. See how it's working? Both sides have protections in verse 3. The employer's investment in employees is protected, but the employee's investment in his own family is also protected. Verse 4 says, okay, but what about? Remember, we talked about a couple weeks ago, this is what's called casuistic law. If this, then that. If this is a scenario, this is the response. Okay, well, if he came in single, he leaves single. If he comes in married, he leaves married. What about if the master does provide him a spouse? What if, while Chris is in the employment, he gets a wife and he doesn't want to leave her behind? Now what? And so verse 4 deals with that. Now remember, if the master provides the wife, she and her children belong to whom? To him. They have a contract. Now, the male servant has to leave single, but he doesn't have to leave without her. There are options available to him. He could find other employment nearby and wait for her obligation to end, right? Like somebody marries somebody in the military, they got to fulfill both contracts. He ETSs early, so he lives in Charleston until she ETSs, and then they move together to wherever. So that's one option available to the servant. Or he could say, I'll pay the remainder of her obligation. He could get a job if he doesn't already have the money available, and he says, look, I'll pay off the $100,000 she owes you. Fine, that's the money I've got invested. We're done. Goodbye. Now, the master doesn't have to accept it, but that's an option. The third option is that he could voluntarily choose to stay in the employment of this master for the rest of his life. I can't afford to leave. I don't want to leave my family. I'll stay. And so he could volunteer to stay. And in fact, it's that third option that's then now described in deeper detail in verses 5 and 6. If this, then that. And so this otherwise free slave who could walk away after 7 years or 6 years, he essentially volunteers to stay. Now, it doesn't mean he's doing it for free, by the way, because what got him there? Some sort of payment. He's just saying, look, I could leave. I'm loyal to this one. It's like free agency in Major League Baseball back in the late 70s. A lot of them left for more money. Created what we know as Major League Baseball now. But did every free agent leave? Have there been some over the years who took less money to stay with the team they knew? Yeah. And typically the hometown fans like them better because they seem to be what? What's the L word? They seem to be loyal. And so he could stay with his spouse, agree to work for the same guy forever, and he could be doing it out of this sense of loyalty. This guy has been good to me. He provided me a wife, a place to live, wages, food, whatever the case might have been. So I'll stay. And then it says, because there's his end of the deal. Now, what's the end of the master's deal? He has to take him before God. So it's a spiritual thing, not pragmatic. Take him before God. and then take him either to the door or the doorpost, and to our sensibility go, wow, to drive a steel awl through his ear, notably probably the earlobe. Give him gauges, so to speak. But here's what that is. You all know what I'm talking about, gauges, right? Some of you probably freaked out a couple years ago when they were really popular. They've kind of died out, not entirely, but not near as they used to be. That's where they started putting in bigger and bigger discs in their earlobe. And so now you could drive a car through some people's earlobes. They're stretched out forever until they have surgery, which is one of the things I tried to warn some of my students who jumped on that band. Look, I don't care if you get ears pierced or not. You realize you're going to look like a Nigerian tribal person with these earlobes that hang down to your waist. Oh, I don't care. And now what are they walking around with? And it's going to cost them money to get it cosmetically fixed. But everyone who's ever seen it knows exactly why this is what God would require of the master and the servant. Because guess what? Everybody can see it. This is not, I got papers in my wallet. Wait a minute. I'm not a servant anymore. Wait a minute. No, you've got a visible sign that everybody can see. And this visible sign protects both parties again. It protects the owner against the accusation of breaking the original contract. Wow, it sure seems like Joey's been your servant for an awful long time, don't you think? Wink, wink. Oh no, Joey said he wants to stay and be my servant forever. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. He let me put an awl through his ear. And so it protects the owner, the master, the employer from accusations of violating the covenant, the contract. It also provides the servant protection in that it gives proof, always visible, of the master's obligations to him now. Because what did the master agree to? Joey says, I'm going to stay. Scott says, great. I get a worker, but what does Scott now have to do for the rest of Joey's life? Pay for him, provide for him. And so the hole in the ear, as weird as it sounds to us, is a visible sign to both parties that they're in this together. In the same way, modern sensibilities, wedding rings. I covered my hand because I'm not wearing mine because my hands were swollen earlier today. Oops. Won't go there. I took it off a lot when I was in the Army. Rarely wore a ring. So I take mine off every night, put it on every morning. But it's a visible sign, right? Same thing here. And it gives both parties in the agreement protections. And so notice in that first paragraph, when I read it earlier, half an hour ago, somebody went, oh, what does that mean? All of a sudden, it's an entirely different arrangement, isn't it? And it's an arrangement that's beneficial to everybody involved. It protects both the master and the slave, the employer and the employee, in a way that everybody understands what it is up front. Because remember, what's the second table of the Ten Commandments relate to? How man relates to whom? Man. You won't steal from me. You've got to pay me. You won't steal from me. You leave my property behind when you finally leave one day. And so the first one is not what it appears. It's much more friendly, if you will. The second one, we'll go back and reread verses 7 through 11 because it's been a while, is another one that seems like something on one surface. It's actually something a little different when we dig deep. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since she has broken faith with her, or he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing without money or payment of money. So we got that slavery thing again. Keep all that stuff I already said in the back of your mind about the words for slavery. But on the first surface, as you read through that, you're going, somebody's selling his daughter as a sex slave. And if it's not to this guy, he's buying her for his son. How vile and disgusting is that? especially in the fact that we live in the 21st century, and we know probably pretty confidently there are sex slaves in Charleston. That's not what this is about. Just like the last one was not about chattel slavery. Our modern sensibilities and understanding about slavery distort our understanding of this passage too. As you read through this paragraph, the issue is not selling one's daughter into slavery as we understand it. So just go ahead and set that out of your mind. He uses the word slave. We've already said slave doesn't necessarily mean slave like we think. It's not about selling your daughter into slavery to some twisted man or his son. The issue here is one of arranged marriages. This is all about arranged marriages. And some people go, that's still horrible. In their culture, every marriage was arranged. Everyone. Meaning probably even jump forward 1,500 years, Joseph and Mary was probably an arranged marriage. And rather than paying a dowry to the groom's family, please take my daughter, right? Or think Leah and Jacob. Yeah, I'll give you stuff for 7 years. Take her. No, don't take the pretty one. She's easy to get rid of. Take the other one. Rather than paying a dowry, what's happening here is her parents receive a compensation. It's not like the modern concept where the parents of the bride pay all the wedding fees. It's the reverse. The husband, potential husband, the master, the one who buys her, he's the one paying. Her parents reap financial rewards for it. And in exchange for his money, what he gets is a wife who will, ladies, don't cringe, serve her husband. You're getting a little woman. And usually the issue is not cooking and cleaning your tent. What's the issue? She's going to bear your children to keep the inheritance in your family. She's given up her inheritance over here. She's now part of this inheritance. That's the whole story, by the way, in the book of Ruth, isn't it? Book of Ruth, chapter 3, beginning of chapter 4. Boaz goes to the kinsman redeemer. You know Ruth. You know Naomi. You're the kinsman redeemer. You have to buy them, essentially. You have to take your money and buy her family land to keep it in, oh, by the way, her family. What? And that's why the kinsman redeemer backs out and Boaz says, I'll do it. Which makes Boaz that much more magnanimous in his gift. Because the other man didn't want to give up his money and run the risk of Ruth having children and his children getting a smaller inheritance rather than a larger inheritance. And so buying the woman here is, in a sense, arranging for the marriage and compensating her family for it. These arrangements are not the same as what's been described in the first paragraph. These are not the same arrangements as the first paragraph. First arrangements is you volunteer one way or the other to work for somebody as their servant for whatever the original deal is. That's not the situation here. Because what's going on in verse 8 is the man has bought a wife for himself. He's invested, but it's for his benefit. And notice what it says in verse 8. If, for whatever reason, along the way, he ends up deciding not to marry her, she doesn't please him once she's there in the house, he has to allow somebody else the right to buy that right from him. Right? It's an investment. He buys her for himself, pays the dowry or pays the compensation, decides he doesn't want to marry her, but he's out 1,000 pieces of silver. He can turn around and sell her to somebody else and get his money back. But he doesn't get to keep her as a slave who has no love or family connection there anymore. And so, both directions, protection. First protection is her purchase price, right? He's paid whatever. Her purchase price, if he chooses not to marry her, can be redeemed to him, protecting his investment. I paid $1,000, I just want $1,000. But what about her? Because some of you go, man, she's getting yanked around. She gets sold by her parents. She gets this guy who may be uglier than sin. Now he doesn't want her, and he can sell her to somebody else. There's even protection here, because notice what it says in verse 8. The original purchaser cannot sell her to foreigners. And so there are protections for her. Because what's going to happen? She's going to be kept in the people of Israel, who will do what? Follow these same rules for her. And so the purchaser is protected, and the potential bride is protected. Again, it's not near as bad as it looks on the surface. But what about, remember, if this, then that? What if he bought her, paid that price to get a bride for his son? What happens to her then, according to verse 9? She's treated like a family member. Treat her like a daughter. In fact, more than just a servant, she essentially has become what? His daughter-in-law. We're all familiar with the phrase. Guess where it comes from? She wasn't a daughter by birth, but by this law, what has she now become? She's become his daughter. Has to treat her that way. Treat her like she's his own. Not owned by purchase, owned by love. So, benefit to the son, benefit to the bride. But verse 10 and 11 wraps all this up. This is all these if this, then that stuff. Verses 10 and 11 say, okay, regardless of who she was, and I got quotes around it, I'll get the handout, purchased for, whether for the dad or for the son, the law protects her rights. The dad's protected. If he bought her and doesn't want her, he can sell her and get his money back, but he can't sell her to a foreigner. If he bought her for her son, he's got to treat her like she's his own daughter. Verses 10 and 11 are all about her rights. In fact, there are more about her rights in here than anything else. For example, according to verse 10, if then this, then that, if he takes another wife, maybe he keeps her and he marries her, but then he finds another one he wants also. Because how much polygamy do we have in the early part of the Old Testament? Up until the exiles in the 720s and the 580s, there's lots of polygamy. By the way, after they come back from exile, there's none. It goes away. But when this happens, God says, not condoning it, just admitting when it happens, let me protect the people involved. If the man takes another wife, he still has his obligations to the first one. She's not aced out because he moved on. Ultimately, it says, he must treat her with equity. Just because he doesn't love her anymore, or just because now he's got two he loves, she's to be treated equally. Her rights are to be protected. And mentions three specific ones. She must receive equal food. Now think of how many times we saw in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis, polygamy where one wife is treated worse than the other one. Not according to God's laws. Equal food. She's also to receive equal clothing. Don't make this one wear rags while the other one gets new stuff all the time. And to put it politely, the original one is also to receive equal attention. That's me tap dancing around the issue. She is to receive equal attention from her husband, which, by the way, Paul said as much as that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. Go read it for yourself. That's in Paul's section about marriages. That some things are permissible for a season, but not forever. There's rights involved within the marriage. I think it plays back into this. So, protect her as well as him. If, at the end of the day, verse 11, he fails to do that, if he breaks any one of those three rules that are there to protect her, he loses because he must release her from her marital obligations. He messes up, she gets the benefit. He's got to let her go. He's got to free her. She's out. She's released from this relationship. And he can't receive any compensation for it. Because he treated her like a wife and then said, you know what, I'm tired of you. He gets nothing for it. He's out. He's lost his investment. You might argue, loosely, that what's being described here is a fulfillment or a precursor for the New Testament idea of abandonment in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. If the husband leaves his wife, Paul says in that section on marriage, because she's a believer and he's not, and he walks away, Paul says she's freed from all her obligations to him, and it's as if she was never married. So divorce isn't even the issue. She's freed. Seems to come from here, I think, or at least is related to this. Now, what's to me fascinating, we're out of time, Paul's discussion of marriage there in 1 Corinthians 7 builds on what he's been talking about in chapter 6. And in chapter 6, he's been talking about Christianity gives us freedom from slavery to sin and brings us ongoing slavery to righteousness. And so Paul moves from a slavery discussion to marriage with no turn signal. Unless, in Paul's mind, what? It's all interconnected. Because think about some of these laws. If the second table is about how we relate to other humans, what happens if we don't obey the laws? We sin. What happens if this man who arranged this marriage dumps her for a younger woman? He sinned. And we don't have to do that. We're no longer slaves to sin. And he moves forward. Sunday, we're back in the book of Mark again this week, looking at Mark chapter 4 still, looking at the fourth of four parables. So go ahead and read in advance the end of chapter 4. Come ready to think about what it is Jesus is trying to tell us and what it is Mark's trying to prove. Let's go ahead and pray and get on out of here. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for your goodness, your mercy. Ask your blessings, Lord, on your word. Lord, use it to change us, to mold us, to shape us into the image of Jesus. May it, Lord, be about more than just information, but transformation. And may, Lord, you be pleased with what we do with what we've learned here. Lord, guide us in all of our relationships with all those around us. And may our relationships with one another reflect our relationship with you. And may you be glorified by it. For all this we ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.